Coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long interview program where we invite a guest host to interview the author of a new book. This week from BookExpo America in Los Angeles, Mahvish Ruksana Khan, journalist and recent law school graduate, recounts her time at the Guantanamo Bay prison as an interpreter for Afghan detainees in My Guantanamo Diary, The Detainees and the Stories They Told Me. Ms. Khan recalls her over 30 trips to Guantanamo Bay and the relationships that she developed with the imprisoned men and her desire to secure them a fair trial. Mahvish Ruksana Khan discusses her book with Nancy Snow, Senior Research Fellow at the University of Southern California Center on Public Diplomacy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Snow, the author of The Arrogance of American Power and Information War. I'm here with the author of My Guantanamo Diary, The Detainees and the Stories They Told Me, Mahvish Ruksana Khan, and I wanted to welcome you to BookExpo 2008. We're here in Los Angeles. It's May, and wanted to welcome our C-SPAN viewers to Afterwards. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to have read your book. I think it's very powerful. It's very personal, it's political, and it tells a story that hasn't been told enough, frankly. But I wanted to start with, there was actually a sentence where, to paraphrase, we're near Hollywood, you had me at, and it was Google that got me to Gitmo. And I wanted to explore that a little bit with you. What really led you on this journey to Guantanamo and then on to Afghanistan and so on?
Well, I was studying all of this in my international law class. And when we were studying the federal torture statutes in Guantanamo, I was just appalled at everything that was going on and how our administration had created this place. And I thought it was a legal loophole. And it was sad that this was happening in America and that the constitutional principles that I was studying were not actually being upheld. And so I was always ranting about it with my friends, and they were, a lot of people got sick of hearing me talk about it, and so I eventually decided to get involved, and I did that by Googling the cases that I had been studying in law school that attorneys had taken to the Supreme Court challenging the detention of these prisoners without habeas corpus. Mm-hmm. And by Googling them, I found out who the lawyers were, and I got in touch with them, and that's how I initially got involved.
And also, too, you were at the University of Miami Law School.
That's correct.
And you had, too, I want to explore your background because I think you had a lot to offer. Given your own background, your language facility. You're from Michigan originally, but tell me about your family and how this story was even more personal to you and how that connected you to the detainees.
Well, my family is Pashtun, which there's a lot of Pashtuns that live in Afghanistan and in Peshawar, right along the border in Pakistan. And so they were people I felt like my own family. I never speculated whether any of them were innocent or guilty, and initially I became outraged simply because of the legal principles at hand, and I wanted to get involved as a Pashtun American, as somebody who speaks the language, and as a journalist and as a lawyer. And when I called the attorneys, I found out that no one spoke Pashto, there was no one with security clearance that spoke the language, so that was how I kind of got in the door with the attorneys, by using my linguistic skills. And I felt like it was something that needed to be done, because these prisoners were there for years and had never even seen a lawyer because they didn't have a translator, and so that's the reason that I got involved. I'd wanted to get involved on a legal level afterwards, but that was sort of the way I got in the door.
I do want to explore what you went through with your background check, because I can identify a little bit with that. But I also love that your mother Mama and Baba Jan, your father. They are both doctors and they met in medical school. But you describe a background really that befits your curiosity and your caring about what was happening at Guantanamo and your reason to investigate their stories. And it was most notably, in Mama's words, now is not the time to be complacent.
My parents have always been very politically active, and my mom was always, when the war in Bosnia was going on, she was out there, we would write letters, collect food for the refugees. And so I learned the importance of civic engagement and human rights and being involved in the world from her. And I always, remember her encouragement. And so I think growing up with that, it was sort of, I could always hear her kind of telling me to...
Were your parents solidly behind this, going to Guantanamo?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, they believe very strongly in that.
Yes.
Do you have siblings?
I have two brothers.
And are they as politically active as you? Because you also describe yourself as idealistic, which you still are, and again, committed to human rights. So is that something that's shared across your family?
I think so. Growing up, we'd always have these discussions around the dinner table, and I think we are a family that we've always spoken about these issues, and it was something that I've grown up sort of cherishing, like our rights and liberties in this country, and to see my country doing this to other people and creating these constitutional loopholes to get around our court's jurisdiction was appalling. And I didn't get involved necessarily because they were Pashtun or Afghan. It was initially because of the legal reasons.
Right.
And it became a whole nother issue once I went to Guantanamo and met the detainees. But initially it was for those principles that I think are very important to society. And
I imagine, though, that you thought you may never get there, because describe the background check. It was 6 months, and I, too, have worked for the U.S. government, the U.S. Information Agency and the State Department, and I remember filling out the application, and you had to account for every place you've lived. Even if you spent 2 weeks over the summer visiting someone, you couldn't have any gaps. You had to, and then we both got that same question, which was, have you ever advocated for the overthrow of the U.S. government?
Which I thought was just the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard, because, I barely have enough time to feed my pet ferret, let alone trying to overthrow the government. But the background check took 6 months, and it was about 10 pages long. I had to write everywhere I'd ever lived, and I've moved around a lot, from internships to school, law school, and it went all the way back to high school. So they interviewed my teachers from college, professors. They went to every place I'd lived, talked to landlords, neighbors. They pulled my transcripts at law school, so it was very thorough. And I was contacted by several agents all over the country, so I know it was definitely a very thorough process that took a long time.
And you did pass the test.
I did.
And again, you started out with this by saying that you were in law school, you're taking these classes, learning about the protections that we have in the U.S. Constitution, such a cherished document. And you say in the author's note, the prisoners at Gitmo never had the chance to prove their innocence. They were never told why they had been brought to Cuba. They were never allowed to be heard in open court. But their perspectives must be aired. And that's what you're doing, essentially, in this book.
Well, I think that for most of America, the administration and the world, the administration has painted these characters, well, they're not even characters, it's one mass entity of nameless, faceless men, and collectively called terrorists and bomb makers. And they're it's kind of shrouded in mystery and on an island far away. Nobody knows who these men are, and they've never been heard. And I mean, I remember going there, and one of the detainees asked me why journalists weren't allowed to interview him. And while the administration allows journalists to Guantanamo, there have been no journalists who have ever been allowed to sit down and interview a detainee. It's just a big dog and pony show where they say they're letting the press in, but
in fact,
it's a total sham.
Well, you use those words, dog and pony show, to refer to the combatant status review tribunals, which I do want to get to. But I want to explore terminology and rhetoric, because Rumsfeld, our former defense secretary, we heard the words enemy combatants, and in his words also, the worst of the worst. And I think that's what you're getting at as well. As long as people remain faceless and nameless, it's much easier in our minds, just I'm a spectator to this process, to think, well, there's probably a good reason why he's there.
And everybody says that. I mean, there must be a reason they're in Guantanamo. They must have done something. And it's easy to call them the worst of the worst when you're not shown who they are, you aren't told why they were picked up, or any of those issues. I mean, in America, even a rapist and a murderer will at least be charged and get a lawyer and have his day in court. But these guys are, I mean, they're stripped of their names, so they're numbered creatures, and nobody knows why they're there or who they are. And my book seeks to humanize them and introduce them to America as people. And I'm not saying that they're all good or bad, but there's no way, and there's no way anybody could know that, because only a trial can separate the good from the bad.
Right. And tell me about habeas corpus. I'm not an attorney. I know it's an important concept, and it's really the crux of the issue here at Guantanamo. You say laws don't get much more fundamental than habeas corpus.
Well, habeas corpus is an ancient safeguard that is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, and literally from the Latin, it means you show us the body. And basically, it is there so that if an individual is being jailed illegally, he has the right to ask his captors why. And that's what habeas corpus is about. These individuals have been imprisoned, and either give us a reason, show us why they're there, or let them go. And that's the essence of what habeas corpus means, and it's something that's been around for, forever.
And we meet a number of detainees in the book, and they're each so distinctive, from doctors to sheep herders to poets, two brothers as poets, all very memorable. I wanted to get to the Combatant Status Review Tribunal. It sounds like it's really a sham, in that they don't get the right to defend themselves. It's almost like they have these invisible charges. Why even have such a tribunal? Was it in response to some public criticism, but it just doesn't seem like it's even worth getting people together, because it's not like a typical trial you would see here.
It is a total sham trial. The combatant status review tribunals allow hearsay evidence. They do not allow witnesses. In hundreds and hundreds of cases where detainees have requested witnesses, either something in writing, or it always comes back with the same answer, that we were unable to locate your witnesses. They're not allowed to have an attorney present. And these are basic elements that a prisoner should have, and it's completely absent in these kangaroo courts.
But I would imagine, though, that if you asked the average American, they probably wouldn't even have heard about these tribunals, much less, of course, what you point out too, how many of these detainees were captured due to bounties.
Right.
And I think that's a powerful part of the book too. I'm going to get into the personal stories, but how did they go out and snare these guys?
Most Americans don't know about the bounties. When we first went into Afghanistan, the U.S. military airdropped thousands of leaflets offering up to $25,000 for Taliban or Al-Qaeda. And some of the leaflets offered up to $5 million.
Right.
I mean, just speaking about the $25,000, it doesn't break any standards of law if you offer a bounty to capture somebody. But the problem is that in Afghanistan, the per capita income is something like $300 a year, which is about 80 cents a day. And when you offer $25,000 to some poor Afghan that's making 80 cents a day, that's like winning the super lotto jackpot. I mean, it's over $2 million if an equivalent bounty program were offered in the U.S. And so there's this huge financial incentive and for locals over there to turn people in. And Afghanistan is a country that has been riddled with war and tribal conflict, political issues, and things go back generations where people have hostilities with each other. And if you add money into the mix, it just created an atmosphere for people to benefit financially. And the problem then came when the U.S. did not investigate these reports that were being made. I mean, people were turning in people left and right, and the reports and allegations were not followed up and investigated. And over 80% of the detainees that landed in Guantanamo were captured and arrested at a time when these huge bounties were being given. And that's the main reason that a lot of innocent people have been swept up.
Now, have these programs continued? I mean, I remember Rumsfeld is quoted saying that the leaflets were dropping like snowflakes in Chicago. So at one time, certainly during and following the war in Afghanistan and probably leading up to the war in Iraq, these leaflets were continuing. But do they still have these
today?
Yeah, these big offerings, or are they?
I mean, maybe for major leaders, I don't know.
I mean, if you can get bin Laden, there's a big payout there.
Right, but I'm not sure if it's still going on. But during the time that most of the current detainees are at Guantanamo, the program was going on.
It's just amazing to me. You would think just simple logic would tell you you're going to get a lot of false positives there.
Right.
In that you can just, I mean, the incentive to try to make a better life for your family, or a grudge, some old tribal grudge.
Well, and that's what these leaflets would say. They would say things like, get millions of dollars, receive money to take care of your whole tribe, books for your kids and food and it was just a total, I mean, it's one thing to draw people in and follow up with an investigation, but these people, a lot of people benefited financially, and there's a lot of the Pakistani intelligence. A lot of people were fleeing Afghanistan, and these police officers were selling individuals to the U.S. military, and if they could pay more, they'd let them go, but if not, they would pass them over to the U.S., and it became this business.
Didn't Musharraf actually boast about this in his book Line of Fire? And he, of course, got a lot of criticism for that, but he referred to them as kind of these gifts that came in. Why hasn't this been written about enough?
Pardon?
Why hasn't this been written about, I mean, the bounties? Because I think when you take something like this that maybe at first blush may seem a little complicated to people, but if you put it in terms of look at what they were dangling in front of people.
I don't know why it hasn't been spoken about more, because I think this is the root of the problem of why so many innocent people have been swept up. And Musharraf did mention that in his book about how the Pakistani ISI had collected millions of dollars in CIA prize money for these prisoners. And
it sounds like let's make a deal.
Right,
It really
exactly.
sounds like a game show.
And a lot of the
atmosphere.
detainees would say that, like they would hear this stuff, and everybody, you know, the Pakistani cops were happy they were getting all this money, and it's sad.
Yeah, because you wouldn't necessarily, as a journalist, need access to the detainees to get that story. I think what you're speaking to a lot in the book is investigating the story, following through, and that anybody can do that. I mean, we have access to so much technology. As you say, Google got you to Gitmo.
Right.
I mean, that's almost inspiring to me personally to follow the story. And I also, with a lot of the data and statistics, you mentioned over 80% of those who were captured coming through like Pakistani security.
Or Afghan warlords.
Or Afghan warlords. Amnesty International, Reporters Without Borders, a lot of these groups that are tireless out there doing the investigative work that some members of our mainstream media aren't doing. And it's so important that we go back and look at these reports, because it was watching the Human Rights Watch executive director on C-SPAN where I learned about a lot of these abuses taking place, really, of due process. That's what we always hear.
And it's unfortunate that it isn't more widely spoken about.
Yeah, I agree.
Because it's the reason why there have been so many wrongfully arrested individuals.
I also wanted to bring up, in terms of the tone of the book, I appreciate that you don't have an agenda so much, that you're allowing the reader to be astute and to draw one's own conclusions. That you, as you said, you don't get into the legalese, even though you're a trained attorney, and you tell stories. And I think that, too, everybody appreciates a good story. Even though there's a lot of heartbreak in here, there's also humor, and it really humanized these detainees. It got me beyond enemy combatants, detainees. And I wanted to mention Dr. Ali Shah, the pediatrician. You know, he had fought against the Russians in Afghanistan, and he says in the book, by our friends and our enemies, we are punished. The Russian bullet is still in my neck. That is a gift from the Russians, and I consider Russia an enemy. These handcuffs in uniform is a gift from our friends. He's referring to American friends, from you. And he had his struggles there with the United States because, again, he considered the U.S. the friend. It was Russia that it was the enemy, but he's being held captive by the Americans. So there must have been all this cognitive dissonance. And you also say that he's unusual and that he's not like a lot of the other detainees. He's married to the same wife that he was committed to from day one. And
he was the first person that I met at Guantanamo. And when I first went to Guantanamo on my first trip, I had expected to meet a terrorist or a Taliban, and I was scared. And I walked into this meeting room and I meet this pediatrician who ended up being probably one of the most gentle, hospitable, and just dignified people that I've ever met. And it totally made, and the next person I met was an 80-year-old paraplegic, and that trip just totally, it just made me feel deceived.
Was that Speedy? The old man?
Right, who couldn't walk.
Right, exactly. And by the end of the chapter about the pediatrician, you write, I don't know exactly what I expected coming to Guantanamo, but you say here, I've been duped. My government has duped me. What did you mean by that? You felt like you hadn't gotten the full story. You were finding out the full story.
Well, I came in expecting to meet a terrorist or Al-Qaeda or somebody who would, wouldn't like me as a woman or didn't like America and would be hostile. And I came in and met somebody who had worked for the United Nations to help increase Afghan electoral support, who supported the democracy of Hamid Karzai, and his wife was an economist. It was just it was shocking because this man was a refugee the entire time that the Taliban were in Afghanistan, and he went back only after they fell, and he was completely against their agenda. He didn't want his daughter being raised there, and now he's being accused of being Taliban, and he's a Shiite Muslim, and Shiites were persecuted under the Taliban, and so for so many different reasons it just didn't make sense. And that's where I felt duped, because this was not the sort of character, and he'd gone back to Afghanistan to open up clinics with his family who are also physicians, and it was just that's why I felt duped, because it wasn't the sort of character that Donald Rumsfeld describes as, a bomb maker.
Well, I think what you're getting at, again, a lesson for all of us, and I hope you will continue to write in this genre, because it is reminding people not to look at everything in black and white, that either you're with us or with the terrorists.
Right.
I mean, that famous saying there, that things are more complicated. There's a lot of gray area there, and that sometimes our so-called enemies may in fact have been allegiance with us.
I mean, he was a friend of America. He fought with against the Russians, with, which was a U.S.-backed war, and he was being accused. And in his CSRT, he was the Combatant Status Review Tribunal. He was accused of fighting against the Russians as if it were criminal, and the whole thing just doesn't make sense. And that's why I felt just deceived by our administration, and that the people who are at Guantanamo, and I'm sure there are bad people there, but by keeping them, hidden in this dark, eerie place without any ability to have a shot at their innocence, you get people like Dr. Ali Shah and 80-year-olds who can't walk or see or hear very well. And
well, I was really struck. It's no Club Med. It wasn't a Club Med for you either. And in fact, even just the flying in sounds horrifying as a woman, to be on a plane without a lavatory.
No bathrooms.
I mean, you described that, and I felt very badly for the attorney who
it caused some
had the necessary
situations.
So we're going to go to a short break, and we've got a lot more to explore. And we're here at the Book Expo 2008, and I'm here with Mahvish Ruksana Khan, author of my Guantanamo Diary. I'm Nancy Snow.
Afterwards, and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. Visit booktv.org. More with Mahvish Ruksana Khan and Nancy Snow in a moment.
Sunday, August 3rd on Book TV. In Depth features Ralph Peters, retired military officer and media commentator. He'll take your phone calls and emails.
Afterwards, with Mahvish Ruksana Khan and Nancy Snow continues.
We're back, and I wanted to, I was talking earlier about the conditions for the detainees. 56 square feet, concrete bed, steel toilet, meals in isolation, so they're really kept apart from one another. 15 minutes of exercise, 2 to 3 times a week.
They're treated worse than like dogs and cats, really.
I mean, it's really amazing. Total lack of sunshine. Here you are. You would think, well, they're there, they could possibly be terrorists, we don't want to spoil them. But there's also more to the story, in that we heard these stories coming out about the desecration of the Quran, and I'm sure you were hearing that as well. There are some really horrific charges being made, and of course that has to be, they have to be proven, but nevertheless, it's really, I can't imagine what that does to a person's soul, guilty or not.
It's debilitating, because, I mean, and a lot of these men they're Muslims, so they pray 5 times a day, and when you don't give a prisoner a change of clothes, they are, they sweat, and they want to be clean when they're praying, and so it creates all sorts of like dicey situations where they'll wash their uniforms in the sink and then air dry them, put on the same wet clothes just so they can pray. And there's all sorts of abuses of dignity. I mean, being given full cavity searches 15 or 16 times in one day in front of other people. I mean, what is the point of that other than to dehumanize people, which is essentially what they're doing, because you strip them of their names, and then in Bagram, before they came, there were instances of having their eyebrows shaved and beards shaved, and this is a part of their culture. And I just saw so many parallels with the way prisoners were being treated in Guantanamo with the way Jews were treated in Nazi Germany. I mean, the whole serial numbers and shaving of hair, and it's sad.
That must have been startling. Tell me the story about the iguana versus the detainees.
Well, it upsets the detainees as well as the attorneys, because the detainees are not, the U.S. law does not extend to Guantanamo Bay, which is the administration's position, but the iguanas that wander around the base are protected by a U.S. federal law, and it extends to them, the Endangered Species Act, and it's a huge fine if anybody, including any federal official, hurts an iguana. But and the guards taunt the detainees with that, so
that the iguanas have actually
more rights than you do.
Oh my goodness. How about the little orange crabs? Because tell me about what it was for you staying there. Your accommodations.
The accommodations, they've actually improved a little bit, but in the beginning it was, it's basically like a small room with minimal facilities, and there were instances of, some people get bed bugs, or when it rains, all of these, hundreds of these little crabs come in, and they would go under the doors, and so the rooms would be infested with crabs, and it was literally the most disgusting thing ever.
Yeah, that sounds pretty awful. I wanted to get into some of the profiles. The goat herd Taj Muhammad. Now, he sounds like quite a character, and you do say in the book, I hate to play favorites, but he really was one of yours, in that he certainly was, kind of in the similar age group, but he was kind of a little punchy guy.
Right. He was, I liked a lot of the men I met, really grew to care about them like they were family almost. So the reason I said that Taj was one of my favorites was more, it was kind of for selfish reasons, because he wasn't as polite as Dr. Ali Shah. He wasn't poor and couldn't walk and with failing health like Haji Nusrat, this 80-year-old man. But Taj Muhammad was just so sarcastic, and I remember in the second meeting that when I met him, he hands me this little piece of paper. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on TV, but and he was like, can you translate what these words mean for me? Yeah. Because the guards wrote him this list of words, and because he had learned fluent English in Guantanamo within a matter of a few years, and so he was constantly trying to improve his English, and he was a total jokester. So he hands me this piece of paper, and I read the words, and the first word was horny, and the second one was pedophile, and third was intercourse, and I'm like,
and I think he really knew the definition, right?
Because, yeah.
He wanted to get a rise from you.
Which worked.
Was it difficult to get books in there? Because I think it was Taj who says that he always wanted books to practice his English, and he said, look, we can get copies of, is it Playboy and Maxim that they could get from the guards?
Well, Taj was harassing his poor attorney to bring him books, and you aren't allowed to bring books for your clients, and so...
Not even the Bible? Was that one of the stories?
Well, one of the attorneys tried to send a Bible in, and he was severely reprimanded. It was never delivered, and he didn't understand why, because, the detainee wanted to read the Bible and just learn more, because the Bible and the Quran are very similar, and just was trying to get a better understanding, and it was totally shut down. But Taj wanted an English Pashto dictionary so he could improve his English. And
Sure.
so there was this back and forth between him and his attorney to try to get that, and it never really happened.
Now, we have libraries in a lot of our prisons here, but no such thing there. Although,
Well, there's books that the military has approved, and like Harry Potter has been approved, but the detainees are totally just sick of reading Harry Potter. I mean, some of them have ended up memorizing it because it gives them something to do.
they can do staged readings if they ever get released, huh?
Right, and right.
I've got to ask you, too, about some of these attorneys. You have a whole chapter on lawyers, and there was one I shared with you earlier that I'm trying to get through life without doctors or attorneys if I can possibly make it. But this Paul Rashkin, I think he's a D.C. attorney, and he explained to Taj,
He's in Miami federal.
Oh, he's Miami, all right. Well, Taj had his reluctance, too. He didn't think the attorneys could be much help. And Paul says it's kind of the theory of chicken soup for the accused, that an attorney is like chicken soup. It can help you to have one, and it's definitely not going to hurt you.
Right.
Kind of gave me a whole new perspective on the need to have an attorney. But did he appreciate that? Did that help
He
Taj
did,
to see the light?
because Taj was reluctant to trust anybody. He didn't believe that an attorney could help him out of Guantanamo. And I think Paul's point was, you're going to be stuck in this place, hidden from the whole world, and at the very least, we're coming from the outside and we're trying. So, and I think it did help. I mean, the second Paul walked out of the room, the first thing Taj said was, "Is he a good attorney? I have better ones." But I think he appreciated it.
Well, it seemed like some of the lawyers there, you described that a barbecue where some of them were saying, well, maybe at least we can bring more global media attention to Guantanamo, as well as possibly shine a light on what this is doing to America's image in the world. And this is something I wanted to explore with you because public diplomacy is my specialty. And, when you look at these bookends of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, what do you think this is doing to, well, we know what it's done to America's image, but how do we go forward from here? Because I know that you wrote this book with an impetus for the reader to maybe go forward, take this further along.
Well, I believe that it's totally eroded America's image as this justice or beacon of justice, and we're also now a poor role model for developing countries by engaging in torture and not following our own laws, let alone international principles. And how can you expect developing nations to, abide by that if we aren't doing it? So I definitely think that it's been a sad chapter in American history.
Did you think about it when you were there meeting with them? Again, given your background, a U.S. citizen, but also sharing a language, sharing a culture. I mean, they got very personal with you, a number of the detainees, and that, older ones would use terms of endearment. What were some of the terms you write, I think, in the book about the doctor and
well, when I walked into the room, the Dr. Ali Shah, his face just lit up the first time I saw him. I was scared of meeting a terrorist. He was scared of coming across like maybe a harsh interrogator, and he saw me in my traditional shawl that women over there wear. It was embroidered the same way, and he told me later that smile was triggered by when he saw me, because he said I reminded him of his younger sister. And he and other detainees, we just familiarized very quickly because there was this cultural connection. And I mean, they were very hospitable towards the attorneys, towards, everyone who came and met them. But I think that they called me these, like, some of the older ones would refer to me as bache, which means like daughter, child, and I think they just wanted some semblance of something familiar and
also just human contact.
Yes.
Because that has to be
right.
really missing there, that isolation that they have. I also wanted to explore the suicides. I remember in '06, I actually blogged about this later, hearing about these men over the weekend. There were 3, I think, all at once, and there was a State Department official at the time, Colleen Graffey, who actually was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Diplomacy, and I remember she made a real gaffe. She told the BBC that the deaths were, quote, certainly a good PR move to draw attention. And I just couldn't believe it. It was a real
right. They call it asymmetrical warfare.
Right. And so these suicides, sounds like a lot of the families said, no way, it didn't happen. And, you know, have they been fully investigated? There have been all of these alleged suicides, but there's really no...
I don't believe they have been investigated at all.
Because it sounds like they wouldn't even have the ability to carry such a thing out. And,
right. I mean, 3 people died at roughly the same time on June 10th, I believe it was,
in 2006. Right, that's right.
And I don't know what happened, but it's one of the chapters in my book is about Salah al-Aslami. He is a Yemeni detainee, and he allegedly committed suicide at Guantanamo. And his family was just outraged because they found out about this on the news, that, you know, 3 detainees had committed suicide and didn't expect that their son would be one of them. And so they wanted to have an independent autopsy and hired these Swiss pathologists to do another autopsy because they didn't buy that it was suicide. And so these Swiss pathologists flew to Yemen when the body was returned for burial, and they found that all of the necessary organs that they needed to investigate were removed. Like, if they died by hanging, why would you remove their larynx and pharynx and all of the necessary organs? And they requested anatomical samples from the military's pathology department, asked for copies of the original autopsy, and they just would not cooperate. And the same happened with the other detainees. Their organs were removed, and there's no response as to, like, you know. And so the independent investigation by those pathologists was inconclusive. It could have been suicide, but it's hard to know when.
It's so troubling. You also write about the chapter, What the Pentagon Said, which is towards the end. I continue to believe that terrorists should receive public trials before they're locked up. Hiding them away from the world at Gitmo or anywhere else without charging them is shady and wrong. It made America look like a lawless thug state and tarnished our nation's image as a beacon of justice in the world, which is just what you said. And it's really amazing, though, at the end, I appreciate so much that there's a redemptive tone, because some of these detainees you meet early on, I couldn't believe it by the end. They had been released, they had returned home, and you were able to reconnect with them in their familiar surroundings. And I mean, that must have been, you've got pictures that prove you're just the grins from ear to ear, but tell me about that experience. And also going to Afghanistan, I mean, you had to take sounded like a tough journey when you went across the border to Kabul. And
meeting those detainees that were released was an amazing experience, because
did you ever think you would do that? Or
I hoped.
Yeah, right.
I hoped I would. And I'd promised all of them that I would. But it was just amazing to see them in their home environment and free, because you see them shackled to the floor, wearing prison garb, and in the most awful, just deprecating environments. And then you see them at home with their families, and they are really who they were saying they were. And it just kind of full circled, and it was amazing to see them at home. And I really, I think that's been like the best experience out of all of this, has been just the ability to see them free and reunited with their children, who some of them haven't seen in like 6 or going on 7 years, and so
they've grown up.
Right.
They were small.
Some of them didn't recognize their children on the airport because they weren't these little kids anymore. They were, tall, lanky teenagers with beards, and it was so, yeah.
And how do they go back, you wonder, to any sense of normalcy?
I know a lot of them, probably most of them, suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and I think that it's sad because Afghanistan, and especially, it doesn't have the tools to deal with issues like this. And some of the detainees are more educated than others and are more self-aware, so they're able to get help. But I'm sure there's
PTSD. It's affected so many of the returning soldiers from Afghanistan, Iraq. It's such a universal problem, and we don't have the resources. I was amazed, though, at their attitudes also toward the United States. Really, they didn't hold the grudge. It's that power of forgiveness, and how can you go forward if you can't forgive? It sounds like kind of a survival instinct, but that's something that really struck me, is that they didn't have this enmity, at least that they shared with you, toward the United States.
One of the prisoners that I met in Afghanistan was Haji Nusrat, the 80-year-old, and one of the first questions he asked me was, can you take me to America so I can have surgery? He was paralyzed and couldn't walk. And I thought he was joking. I was like, what? America's imprisoned you for all of these years, and why don't you go to France or Germany or London? And he just went on this tirade, and he was like, I've never believed that this was America's fault. I didn't have anything against the U.S. government or the Afghan democracy. And he was like, it was just amazing to see what a good heart he has. And if I were in his position, I don't think I would be so great.
He can see the good that's being done, so he again isn't painting with
his own son. One of his sons is a senator in Karzai's parliament, so they obviously embrace the democracy that's been brought.
Right.
And it's just it's amazing to see that despite everything they went through, that they weren't filled with hate.
Yeah, that is so striking. And even Abdul Salam Zaif, the former Taliban ambassador, seems like a contradiction in terms there. But and also Guantanamo detainee. He was at Gitmo for 3 years and 5 months, released, and he says something very striking, again, in terms of public diplomacy. He says, initially I thought it was the policymakers and the American government that were to blame, not the American people. But the American people voted for Bush a second time, although I do believe the American government has taken the American people hostage. They live in fear of their government's lies. And then when he was asked, would you ever visit America, he said, no, I have no interest in that. So maybe in his case, he thought you elected Bush a second time. That may have been, but as he says here, even the American people may have been duped.
Right.
It sounds like they all come to different conclusions, but it was just so striking again that some could be so incredibly forgiving, because it gives me a sense of hope that we don't have to keep creating these enemy images that have lifelong durations. Because I wonder about what's going to happen to these young people growing up with a parent who was away all that time. What kind of a grudge or not will that child build?
I wonder about that too, and I hope that, what I've seen is pervasive with the other detainees, but I mean, when I'm speaking of some, I don't know how all of them are reacting. I mean, it's very possible that some do develop a hatred, but
how did this change you? I mean, as a person, you know,
it's definitely made me a lot more cynical.
I thought you were going to say that it's made you a lot more optimistic. So, but your book, though, I think is so powerful in that it's not cynical, and I really do as an author and as a writer, and we identify so much with that. It inspires me to really kind of dig deeper, dig below the surface. That's something that we all need to do. You know, I could look at you on the surface and draw some conclusions. Right. You could look at me. You say when you first go to Guantanamo, you felt like, oh, I'm meeting a terrorist. I mean, even in your own mind, with all of your intellect, you can't help but sort of stumble over that.
Well, that's all
stereotype.
I was told
that's right.
on
sure.
the news, and you tend to believe it after a while. And I think the essence of their stories is to show people that we're a lot more similar to these men than we are different. Because, I mean, I think Muslims have been so just vilified, and the point of the book is to give these detainees a voice, but also to help, you know, bridge cultures and to show that a lot of these men have the same aspirations and goals that we do, and they have children and wives back home, and they have the same right to liberty and challenging their detention as any American does.
I was so glad that you had pictures in here. You even include pictures of the leaflets and pictures of the children, that those were allowed to be released, because again, it humanizes, and it does show there's this global humanity that I think is a hopeful message. Now, where do you go from here? I mean, are you going to continue to engage in journalism and follow up on this, or are you going to practice law, or what are your plans now?
I definitely plan to practice law. I have one detainee client at Guantanamo. I'm being supervised in my representation of him, but I'll continue to work on this as long as he's there, and I hope to continue working as a journalist as well. I started out asking you about your family, and I wanted to bring them up again, because I think they've been so influential, and the messages that they've given you. It almost seems as if you were told you could do anything, you could be anything, and they must be so proud of you with this journey that you've gone on. I mean, you must really feel I hope
that.
They are.
I don't think they'd be disappointed, but it's amongst all the detainees, was there, you know, anyone that, particularly I mentioned Taj Muhammad, but that really stuck out for you? Because they all seem to have really been of great influence.
I think they were all so different, and as different as any two people can be, and a lot of people assume that they're just, you know, they're all Muslim and they're all either Arab or Afghan, so, but personality-wise, they're all so distinct. And I think Dr. Ali Shah resonates most with me because he was the first one that I met, and I think I was just more sensitive to my surroundings, and
he has such a dignity.
He was so dignified, and just the most horrible, and just so hospitable. I mean, we would bring him food, and he wouldn't start, and all of them did this, but they would wait for us to start eating before they would start. And I mean, they definitely didn't lose their manners there, and would always stand when we were leaving and stand when we came in. Just little
I'd love
gestures.
for my students to do that.
But he was just so respectful and just a kind, gentle person.
Well, I've got to ask you about Starbucks, because it sort of takes on kind of a life of its own. You bring them a particular Starbucks flavor to remind them of home. Can you tell me about that? We've got just a few more minutes, but This isn't a commercial for Starbucks, but it's just
there's
such
a Starbucks on the base.
Yeah.
There's also a McDonald's and a KFC, but I would bring them. I mean, I'd also cook for them sometimes, like meals from home. But I always wanted to bring something that they could be familiar with. And Starbucks chai is similar to chai that they might drink in Afghanistan or Peshawar, and it was the closest thing, and I brought it for them for a while.
And I meant to bring this up earlier. There was, you did go through quite a journey in that you had some hopeful messages, redemptive messages, but very striking to me was this quote from Tom Wilner, who from the Washington Law Office of Shearman and Sterling, and he says, "It's naive for us to think that evil is committed only by people who appear like monsters or ogres." And in his words, he said, "Guantanamo is evil. It's a place where men have been imprisoned for more than 5 years without charges and without any sort of fair hearing on the basis of only the flimsiest of allegations." That may have been where a little bit of your cynicism was creeping in. I think what you're calling for here is let's have a fair accounting. Let's find out the truth. I mean, that's what journalists seek, and that's what I think all of us, we want justice here and get to the truth. So,
and I think the problem has been that good and bad, everybody's been swept up, and the only way to separate the good from the evil is to have a fair trial. And if you find that they're really evil and they've done these things, even though they haven't been charged, then lock them up. But
well, I tell you, on that note, I wish we had another hour, but your book is, again, very inspiring. I love the stories.
Thank you.
I know that these men appreciate that their stories were told, and I thank you for writing this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us.
Historian Simon Winchester, in his book The Man Who Loved China,